Imagine you live on a cold, wet island, often shadowed by fog or generally cold weather, and your daily sustenance is brought in by hunting or fishing marine wildlife. Then, suddenly, you are removed from that environment and taken to a foreign land where no one speaks the languages that you speak, and you only have 2 cups of white rice to consume daily. 46 residents of Alaska's most remote island, nearly all of them Alaska natives, were taken prisoner during World War II, and half of them did not return home. This is their story. Welcome back to Dark Narratives. On this channel, we go over a lot of dark stories and true crime. Today, we explore perhaps some of the least known American prisoners of war and the hardship they had to endure for 3 years before finally being able to return to their homeland of the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. Without further delay, let us begin. Today, we are headed to a massive region of America that is, in many places, closer to Russia or Japan than the American mainland. And a quick fun side fact that involves a Russian island visible from Alaska: in 1987, as a personal peace offering, a long-distance swimmer by the name of Lynn Cox swam from the Alaskan island Little Diomede to Big Diomede, also known as Ostrov Ratmanova in Russian, easing Cold War tensions between the US and the Soviet Union. The waters were freezing 3 degrees Celsius that day, or 38 degrees Fahrenheit. She was greeted by Russian officials when she arrived on Big Diomede. Heading further south, however, we find the chain of islands, the Aleutian Islands, where our multi-year story begins. The islands were named after Russian fur traders from the 18th and 19th centuries traveling through Alaska, and other remnants of Russian trade exist to this day. You'll find many Alaska natives referred to colloquially as Inuits that have Russian names, and even some places where a new and not entirely accurate version of the Russian language has been preserved. Their way of life, which continues to present day on some Alaskan islands, includes trapping foxes and hunting seals, whales, fishing, and gathering eggs from seabirds native to the regions to survive. Last but not least, Russian Orthodox Christianity is the majority religion in this very remote part of America. The majority weather conditions in the Aleutian Islands are characterized by cold, if not freezing temperatures, strong winds, and frequent fog and rain. The islands experience a maritime climate with relatively mild summers and very cold, very wet winters. The region is known for its persistent cloud cover and unpredictable weather patterns, which can include snowstorms and high freezing winds throughout the year. In other words, for a majority of the time, you won't see any sunlight. But you might be surprised to learn that 2 islands of Alaska were captured and occupied for just under a year during World War II. Today, we're going to examine the history of the westernmost island in the chain of the Aleutians known as Attu, what happened to the native inhabitants of this island during and after its occupation, and what they had to do to endure surviving World War II. On June 3rd and June 4th of 1942, less than a year after Pearl Harbor, an often overlooked battle between the Imperial Japanese Navy and American forces took place in Dutch Harbor on Alaska, resulting in a conflict that claimed 60 lives in total in just 48 hours' time. The reaction of the American military leadership at the time was to evacuate as many civilians from the Aleutian Islands as possible. The villages of Borka, Kashiga, and Makashin were all evacuated in reaction to the conflict that took place. Reports indicate that in May of 1942, just days prior to the battle, attempts were made to evacuate Attu Island as a precaution against an attack by the Japanese Navy, but were called off due to unfavorable weather conditions. Recent popular media may have made you aware of Admiral Nimitz, who was in charge of the American Pacific Fleet, and he was working with his team to try to decode radio chatter picked up by the Japanese Navy in the Pacific. The intercepted transmissions by the United States Navy did lead them to believe that outposts in Alaska would be targeted, and the response at Unalaska from US forces was appropriate but not overprepared. From a tactical perspective, Japanese military leadership was hoping the Americans would over-fortify and overreact to a military strike on Dutch Harbor, while they also attacked the island of Midway. It cannot be overstated that the attack on Dutch Harbor on Alaska came first on June 3rd of 1942, but the Battle of Midway began on June 4th of 1942. The Japanese Imperial Navy was sincerely hoping that this would cause an overreaction and over-reinforcement of Unalaska and the Aleutian Islands, and that would divert defensive forces from the Americans away from Midway. As the Battle of Dutch Harbor was taking place, transmissions were sent out in all directions via the radio tower at the harbor. A radio operator on Attu Island, known as Charles Jones, living with his wife, Etta, had received such radio transmissions. They could do nothing but hope and pray that American reinforcements would come to their rescue, because geographically speaking, a crippled American military force at Dutch Harbor would not be able to rescue them. On the morning of June 7, 1942, the residents of Attu had noticed Japanese ships encircling their island. Among the villagers, 6 young men got together with their hunting rifles and were contemplating fighting off the Japanese army, but were convinced not to fight them by a village elder, stating the near-hopeless situation of 46 lightly armed villagers trying to fight potentially hundreds of better-equipped troops. The Japanese soldiers made landfall from the beaches on the north side of the island. Initial aggression by the soldiers caused them to fire into the village, but when Japanese military officers arrived, they were told to stop firing and occupied the village. Some of the Japanese soldiers had harmed or killed their own due to friendly fire in the process. At this point, after sending a mayday message from the island's only functioning radio and then destroying the radio and refusing to help fix it, the Japanese forces had killed Charles Jones, then informed the Attuan villagers that he took his own life. A long occupation began, and the villagers were only allowed to leave home to hunt or fish for food with the permission of their occupiers, who in many cases stole some of it for their own consumption. In September of 1942, just 3 months after occupation began, due to mounting fears of an American counter-invasion on the island of Attu, the Japanese Navy evacuated the Attuans along with Mrs. Jones on a merchant ship, making a stop at the island of Kiska before taking a 2-week-long journey to the city of Otaru, which is located in the northernmost island of Japan, Hokkaido. During this trip, the Attuans were forced to reside in the cargo of the merchant ship. One of them died due to disease, and the corpse was forced to be tossed overboard. They were not able to bathe, and if their voyage was much longer than 2 weeks, their living quarters would have definitely become a fierce breeding ground for disease. Upon their arrival in Otaru City, Mrs. Jones was separated from the Attuans and sent to the Rabaul nurse camp, a camp where many other female prisoners of war were kept. The hardship that the Attuans had to face involved the remainder of the 41 people living in a single building with 5 rooms, some with abstract room dividers put in place to give a sense of privacy. From time to time, they had to deal with aggressive guards who had no way to communicate with them other than by writing short notes in simple English. The daily routine for the adults included working 8 hours a day for 0 wages, although they were supposed to be compensated 1 to 2 yen per day that they worked, digging up dolomite. After arriving in Otaru, the little food that they had packed from Attu had almost completely run out, and the little food they were given consisted of almost exclusively small rations of white rice. However, the guards of the compound that they lived in did not have much better rations for themselves either. Over the next 3 years, due to their malnutrition, the labor they had to perform, and the fact that they were fed a lot of white rice with few exceptions along the way, the remaining Attuans developed diseases like tuberculosis and beriberi, which gradually consumed them one by one. 5 babies were born in the community of Attuans that lived in Otaru, but of those 5, 4 of them passed away due to complications that arose from malnutrition of their mothers during pregnancy or nursing. In comparison with the Chinese and Korean prisoners taken by Japan during World War II, however, the Attuans had an easier living situation, even though it was clearly and slowly taking their lives. Imagine parts of food you wouldn't ordinarily consume, but had to consume because there was nothing else you could eat for sustenance. This was the case with the Attuan community living in Japan. One survivor remarked that he ate the skin of an orange because he was starving and nothing else could be found. As time passed and the end of the war was coming near, the Attuans were being told by their captors to dig trenches for the Japanese forces stationed in Hokkaido, preparing for a land invasion by American forces. Luckily, the strife of the Attuans in Otaru had come to an end. Of the 41 that had arrived, 26 of them survived, including, presumably, 1 baby. They marked the building they resided in with the letters POW on the roof. A supply plane flew by the quarters and dropped drums of food and other supplies. Every one of them rejoiced at the fact that they had good food for the first time in nearly 3 years. The Attuans had no idea that atomic bombs were used to end the war. They were simply informed that American soldiers had arrived in Japan and there were major changes to their daily routine and they were free to do as they pleased. For a few weeks, they went out and explored Otaru, and quite interestingly, some of them managed to find a Russian Orthodox church that they attended services for in the city for some time. Their journey home would last several weeks, if not months. First, they were transported by an American military plane from Hokkaido to Okinawa. For most of the remaining Attuans, it was their first time to ever set foot on an airplane. The next stop they made was for a few weeks in the Philippines, staying at an American military camp, and then finally boarding a large ship with American soldiers heading to San Francisco. From there, the Attuans boarded a train to go to Seattle, Washington for a few weeks, where many of them had their tuberculosis treated. After that, it was a long trip back home to the Aleutian Islands. However, sadly, their home no longer existed. From the 11th to the 30th of May of 1943, a battle to reclaim Attu Island ensued, and this resulted in the liquidation of about 3,700 lives, 2,872 of which were Japanese soldiers on the island. And along with that, the homes of the villages of the Attuans who were occupied and later forcefully evacuated became destroyed. Although in the post-war Aleutians, the Attuan community expressed clear interest in rebuilding their village and resuming their way of life, this couldn't be done at Attu due to their own dwindling community population. It has also been documented in the memoir of this incident, Attu Boy, that the remaining Attu community was not strong enough to repopulate the area. The remaining community of the Attu people, numbered at 24 individuals, resettled in other parts of the Aleutian Islands, primarily Atka, Adak, and the communities and regions surrounding Dutch Harbor. In total, 22 Attuans deceased, including 4 infants that were born since the occupation of the island of Attu began, and 24 survived, including 1 infant that was born in 1945 in Japan. The next time you see anyone who says they might be pro-war in one capacity or another, please remember this community, their forced relocation, the hardships they faced, the fact that none of them were treated as combatants, and also the data that shows that just a little bit more than half of them survived and they were not able to return to their homes. Today, there is no permanent settlement of people living on Attu Island. The last remaining inhabitants were Coast Guard personnel operating a long-range navigation system in August 27th of 2010. There is a memorial that stands on the island to commemorate the end of World War II. Today's story was a little bit different, but this is a topic that I found very long personal interest in. In my free time, I casually just look around at the most obscure places on Google Earth, and I noticed that this was the westernmost island that belonged to the continental United States. So I decided to research the topic of its history, and that's how we got today's video. Please let me know what you guys think of this topic in the comments. As always, remember that every day is a new opportunity to see the light, and until next time, I bid you all farewell.